Everyone, thank you so much for waiting as well. And first of all, thank you, Christina, for organizing this. It's absolutely amazing. I find it so inspiring to see the master classes and the different presentations. So it's wonderful for me to be here with you and take part in this. As Christina described, I'm going to talk about musical translation. But just before that, let me introduce myself very shortly. So I'm Noémi Győri. I'm from Budapest, from Hungary. And apart from many concerts and my teaching activities at the Royal Northern College of Music, I have just completed my doctorate at the Royal Academy of Music. It's a very exciting thing in my life, as I'm actually the first flutist to complete this degree at the Royal Academy of Music. I just had my defense, and hopefully very shortly I can receive the actual diploma. The title of my thesis is Reimagining the Flute and Guitar Through Musical Translations of Keyboard Works by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Is everyone here with me? Because I just lost Christina. I hope I'm not losing you. Or
I'm still here. I just turned off the video so you can just have the full screen.
sorry, after the little incident before the lecture, I was for a moment thinking that I might have lost you. Anyway, all right. So that's my doctorate. And today I'm going to talk about musical translations. So first, I would like to tell you how I have come to create musical translations. I would like to also introduce my project, the Classical Flute and Guitar Project, and how I have set that up and how I approached making musical translations through this project. Of course, I would like to explain what exactly musical translation is and how I find it different to transcription making. And then I would like to share some points about what were challenges, various aspects to consider while making these musical translations. Very shortly still about myself. So I think on a general level, I'm someone who really likes to challenge things and expand borders. So I similarly approached my instrument this way. I always was interested to find how far I'm able to go with my instrument. So very early on, I already started to build original projects that showcased repertoire that others weren't so interested to play. So I, first of all, commissioned many works from different composers. I even founded a contemporary music festival in Budapest that I was leading together with my husband, Gergely Madaras, for 6 years. And we have premiered more than 100 works of young Hungarian composers, including many that involve the flute. I was also interested in discovering historic pieces that haven't been played before or that haven't been published before, and to that palette added transcription making. So I was also drawn to experiment with playing pieces that were originally composed for other instruments, just because I felt that in that way I'm not dealing with my own instrument, but I'm just dealing really with music on its own. And also because I felt that instruments and the authority of an instrument and the capacities of a performer is very often judged by what repertoire the performer and the given instrumentalist is playing. And because we all know that some parts of the flute repertoire isn't as rich as others, I was really interested in challenging how we can actually expand the authority of the flute on those fronts. So these are just the basics how I thought about repertoire and how I thought about my instrumental playing. I would like to now introduce you the classical flute and guitar project, which actually stood in the center of my doctorate. So I devoted a lot of my attention and time during the past 5 years to develop this project and to develop these pieces that were part of this project. And before I'm going to talk about that, let me start by showing you a little example of a Haydn sonata that was one of the transcriptions that we created throughout this project. And so you can listen how this is. Let me share my screen. 1 second. And we should find here. This is from Haydn's D major sonata. So that was the snippet I wanted to share with you. And let me open the presentation as well. So you are able to follow some of the examples that I wanted to show you. Yes, so I'm going to talk about the classical flute and guitar project, which is basically one example of my various activities, which aims to challenge the perception of the flute, its repertoire, and obviously when playing with the guitar, my aim was similarly to showcase unique repertoire and reveal new qualities of the combination of these two instruments. I have been actually playing more than 15 years together with Katalin Koltai guitarists with whom I have built this project. And because we are super determined and crazy people, we actually probably played through the majority of the flute and guitar repertoire in the first few years when we were playing together. So we literally moved into her grandmother's home and played from morning till evening and took all the music from the library to get an overview of what was there available for the flute and guitar. And for some reason, I'm not able to turn the page. 1 second. Uh-oh. All right, here it is. One of the first major projects that we actually built with Katalin was a discovery of the music of Antonio Nava, who was an early 19th century Milanese composer, and he composed many, many pieces for the flute and guitar. And they were very unique because they actually showcased the two instruments much more equally and in a much more challenging way than the usual repertoire of the time, which was very much solo for the flute and accompaniment for the guitar. And here is a small example from the score of these pieces. You can see that these are early publications. So they haven't really been published ever since, and they are actually in the collection of Massimo Agostinelli, an Italian guitarist who has researched Italian guitar repertoire in various libraries and was specializing in just discovering things that haven't been cataloged or properly published. If I'm able to escape from here, yes I am, then I'm going to switch back to our live, sorry, I'm trying to stop share so I can come back to you. I hope it worked. Now I would like to show you that as a result, we actually produced a CD. So this was published in 2011, and it showcases all the works of Nava that we found the most interesting. There is only one, the Serenata Opus 16, that was previously recorded and published. Everything else hasn't been recorded. And because of that, because of recording this CD and because of this discovery, I particularly became very interested in just understanding how the flute and guitar formation was born, and how it was formed. And I think many of you might know Giuliani, who is probably the best known flute and guitar composer from the early 19th century. And he lived in Vienna, and most of the influential duos that he created were composed in Vienna. So that kind of started an interesting idea, or ignited an interesting idea in our heads, because we started to think about, well, that's very interesting. So Giuliani actually knew Beethoven. He played in all these Viennese salons. He was well known. Well, what if he had inspired the Viennese classical composer giants to compose for this formation? How would that sound like? And basically, that was the way we had started to play around with this idea of transcribing music of these composers. Now I'm going to go back to the presentation, and I hope you see my yes, view slideshow. So we are back to the full screen. We basically aimed to ground a new kind of repertoire which showcased both instruments equally, so in a very challenging way, equally putting it in a solistic position, and also to create ways in which we can develop things together within the piece. we wanted to create substantial and complex works because very many of the original works were shorter and they were meant for entertainment, and there aren't real substantial sonatas for this ensemble. And so when we were thinking about these composers, we obviously inspected their various compositions, and we have come to the conclusion that the keyboard pieces of Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven would be a very, very interesting area to focus on, because they are canonic masterpieces, so they represent a very, very, very special place within the pianistic repertoire, especially if we talk about Beethoven sonatas. They are substantial, and so they offer the possibility for these two instruments to really showcase their potentials. But they are also not too densely composed, so they are still possible to transcribe in a way where we felt that during this distillation process or translation process, we are not losing too much of the original text. So basically, with this, our aim was to highlight musical characteristics that are traditionally not associated with this formation, and with that, challenge how the flute and guitar, and for myself, how the flute is seen in general and how it is perceived. We had to inspect whether there are any transcriptions, existing transcriptions, that took these keyboard works, or any keyboard works of these composers. I must add that the works that we have finally focused on, they were only works that no one ever has transcribed for the flute and guitar before. So there were other examples, and I think they are very important, because knowing that there are historic transcriptions of works of, for example, Mozart or Beethoven for the flute and guitar shows that this was part of the practice at the time. This was something that is historically there already within our field. And here you can see an example of Andreas Trake's transcriptions of a Mozart sonata. So it says Mozart sonata in A major, but it is actually a patchwork of from two works of Mozart. And this is also very typical of transcriptions that are historic transcriptions. So the various composers or players that would create transcriptions, they kind of scissor together different pieces. So when the original composition became really complex, they just kind of rounded up a section and scissored there a different section of a different piece. Interestingly enough, these pieces were still titled sonatas, as if they were complete works of a certain composer, or very often were labeled that way. Diabelli's transcriptions from various Beethoven works, potpourri, is an exception, because he gave the title potpourri. I will show you a little part from the music. So here you can see the original piano music, and then here is the transcription of Trake. And it is really, really interesting and very typical of these transcriptions that I have selected a very easy, or, well, so to say, easy see-through bit of the sonata. And even in this section, you can see, for example, these ornamented sections in the guitar were just simplified, and you can see that the harmonic changes are also left out. Very often in the flute, part, things were also simplified. So runs were simplified, articulations are often simplified. So basically the end result of the flute and guitar piece is a much more simplified version of the original. If we look at the current trends, we find also several pieces of transcriptions that are similar to the historic ones, which means that even though they are titled as full sonatas, they are only addressing a certain movement of a sonata or a part of a piece, and they also really simplify the flute and guitar part. So here is an example of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which is one of the very, very, very few transcriptions of Beethoven works for flute and guitar. And when I saw this in Kirsi Benedict's doctorate, which lists all the available flute and guitar repertoire, I was super excited and I ordered the music right away. And then, much to my surprise, this is what arrived, and this was the very first movement of the Moonlight Sonata, and you can see that it does. I think we can agree that it doesn't really capture the depth and complexity of Moonlight Sonata. Of course, the first movement is in a sense the most straightforward to transcribe, but even here we see guitar accompaniment, and again, a much simplified version of the piece. The other typical trends in transcription making, and I think this is not only true for the flute and guitar formation, but also for the flute in general, is that there are many transcriptions that aim to basically copy the score. So if it was flute and guitar, then the guitar would play the left hand and the flute would play the right hand. And the aim would be to make as little changes as possible from the original score and make sure that we are playing note by note the same things that, let's say, the violin would play or the piano would play or whatever instrument would play that we are transcribing from. And I think this is quite a natural way to approach transcription making today. So this is exactly the way how I approached transcription making at the beginning. But the more and more we were experimenting with this together with Katalin, the more and more we developed the feeling that this may not be the right or to us the best way to approach this process, because when but let me switch back actually, because you're just seeing this stop share so you can see me again. So basically, the more and more we worked with these pieces, copying the notes at first, the more and more we realize that it may not be the best way to actually capture the piece. Let me tell you an example. So, for example, if on the piano there is a little run on the very top register, which is really soft and very delicate, if I would just play that on the flute in comparison to the guitar, for example, but even if I was comparing it to the piano, it would be extremely difficult to make that so soft and so easygoing, and I think it may be something that wouldn't have been written by the composer originally for the flute at the time, just because if we think about the instruments that were used at the time, that register and playing that register in piano would be nearly impossible, so it wouldn't be idiomatic anyway for the instrument. So I started to experiment with other ways to create that kind of effect on the flute. So that is one example. Or another example is, for example, if there is a jump on the piano, for example, we are in a minuet, again an easy texture, and there is a jump on the piano. It works extremely differently than if we imagine the same jump on the guitar. So however much a guitarist will practice that jump, it will never have that kind of ease as it has on the piano. But if we find, for example, a different register, if we share, for example, that bit between the flute and guitar, we can find ways to capture that moment, create variation if the composer is using the jump to create variation, but in an idiomatic way in the language of our instrument or of our duo. I hope that this is understandable, these little examples. I will show you later on some musical examples. Of course, the instruments work very differently. The flute and guitar work very differently, and the flute and the guitar work very differently from the piano. So again, there are certain things like long trills on the piano, which work really difficult in a difficult way on the guitar. On the flute, we have to breathe, so we have to consider that many of the legatos need reconsideration, or actually they need to be reconsidered to enhance the flow of the music. So sometimes they need to be reconsidered to be shorter, to allow us to breathe, or to allow us to create a better balance with the guitar, and sometimes to prolong those sections, those legato sections, to create a better flow to the piece. So all of these were things that we needed to inspect in detail. I have made a little chart. So again, I'm going to share the screen where I summarize some of the things that we needed to think about. And again, I hope that I can, yes, slideshow. So we are here at the laboratory. So basically, we named our rehearsals laboratory because the aim was to really experiment with many different things. And I really advise you to use your personal space to for practicing, and personal space of rehearsal also for a laboratory work, because that's the moment when you really can experiment with things around, and you can see what works and what doesn't work, and you can really stretch yourself to try out things that you haven't tried before. So here is our laboratory. And these are just some of the points that interested us. So here you can see, as I mentioned, how each theme works on the two instruments. So we had to see how the themes work on our instruments in relation to the piano, and then in relation to each other, so between the flute and guitar. And if you are transcribing or translating for a formation, then I think this is something that you need to consider. So this would be the same between the flute and the piano, or any other combination of instruments. This was especially important because, as I already described, our aim was not to use left hand, right hand distribution for the two instruments, but actually to create a dialogue between the two instruments, which meant that we wanted to share the different themes. We wanted the different themes to answer each other, or the different parts to answer each other. But in order to create a dialogue, we had to find ways in which this dialogue was presented in the best way on our instruments, which are so fundamentally different from each other as well. We had to see what happens when we dramatize an originally monologic texture, because if we work from a keyboard repertoire which is designed for one performer, we can regard that as a kind of monologue. It is designed for one person, performed by one person, and when we create a duo from that, then we we inevitably dramatize, and we inevitably create a much more spacious performance of the piece. And to me, actually, that process was rooting from interpretation itself. So I think, at least the way I approach general flute repertoire as well is I kind of create a hierarchy within the piece. I want to highlight certain parts, and I want to lesser highlight other parts, or if I play with the piano, is the same. I think this is probably true for all of us, that it's a natural thing that we want to understand, and we want to interpret what the composer has meant, and we want to highlight our understanding and our interpretation in the best way. When we are transcribing, this becomes to a next level, because some of the time we have to eliminate certain notes or even certain lines from the music. So this kind of interpretation becomes even more highlighted. So it is almost like writing down our hearing of the piece, our understanding of the piece, our hearing of it on the flute and on the guitar. Another key idea was to have virtuoso changes between the two instruments. That was really interesting and challenging, because when you play something really virtuoso on one instrument, it's a very different task than when you want to share that with another instrument. So you really have to work extremely closely as a duo when you do that. But I think therefore this repertoire becomes really interesting to perform and to play. Again, here I mentioned the dialogue to create. Another interesting and important thing was the range of registers that our instruments have. So very often, even those transcriptions that are aiming to actually copy note by note the music, those transcribers make changes in the register, because obviously the flute or the guitar has less registers in comparison to the piano. I think, of course, we have had to apply register changes due to that very often. But I think we have applied these register changes probably much more often than if you just apply them when you must apply them. So we try to use this as an interpretation as well. So when I looked at the part that I was creating on the flute, I wanted to create a coherent translation. So I wanted to apply those register changes in a very logical way, so that throughout the composition, all of these register changes made sense, and they weren't only applied on moments where they must have been applied, and then therefore I would have created different versions of a theme. So I wanted to keep everything very coherent. We experimented with sharing cadenzal passages, and also I more and more experimented with adding cadenzal passages. That means if there were cadenzal parts in the piano, I as time passed, I more and more transcribed those for the flute in a flutistic way. So I started to think, okay, what are the elements that the composer is using? And I was trying to find a parallel on my instrument, or I was trying to see how Mozart would use the flute in a similar situation, how he has used the flute in cadenzal passages of the concerto. In the Haydn sonatas, there are some moments where you can add cadenzas, and I became more and more again brave to add the cadenzas there. And my aim with that was also actually to kind of create a link between the new part that is following the cadenza and the previous part in a way that is most idiomatic for the flute and guitar, which was, again, very, very different from the piano. We wanted to keep as much of the natural texts that are not too pianistic. So obviously, the very pianistic bits needed to be more heavily translated to our duo. And then, of course, we still wanted to have some parts which could work in a solo and accompaniment, so melody and accompaniment version, just to have some of the style of the original repertoire. And then here, again, a point about inspecting various things that work differently on our instruments. We also experimented with using, for example, harmonic notes on the guitar to create more difference in the timbre. So just to use all the possibilities of our instruments that were used in the early 19th century to kind of make our translations more colorful. Why do I keep calling this process translation? Here are a couple of points to make that even clearer. So basically, the concept is to make these pieces very much at home on our instruments. So, of course, to keep the original text, but as much as we can. But on those moments where it doesn't, where if we copy the original score, it feels alien to the original composition. It distorts the original composition. That is the moment where you have to create the translation. You have to make changes according to your instrument. And that is the moment actually where the aesthetic understanding of the translator or the transcriber really comes into picture. So it becomes a very complex aesthetic question, what I decide to change, how much I decide to change. For example, I described that I wouldn't use extremely high notes that were not idiomatic at the time. This is also a decision because on our instruments, of course, this register works differently. So there are others who believe that we should use those. To me, it was very important to stay true to the idiomatic language of the flute of the time, but also to use the possibilities of the modern instrument. When we had to remove some of the notes or some of the musical lines, I kind of more and more saw that as a distillation process. So it is a bit like when we are interpreting a Bach sonata, we have to see the big picture. So we have to see what are the important harmonic moments, what are the important notes, what are those that we cannot miss, and then what are the others that are lesser important. So in a similar way, we had to make our own interpretation and distill the music based on our understanding of the score. Another very interesting aspect was the adaptation of the articulations for the flute and guitar. So when we see a pianistic score, obviously when we read that and translate it to our instruments, we have to keep in mind that the pianists are often using pedaling. Interestingly enough, from the Haydn sonatas, the Mozart D minor fantasy, and the Beethoven Les Adieux sonata that we were transcribing, only the Beethoven sonata has actually markings for the pedal, and even that only in the second and third movement, and very few of them. However, we of course know that, especially in Beethoven, but also in the Mozart fantasy, many scholars are writing about the practice of using the pedal. So again, this is something where the interpretation and the aesthetic understanding of the transcriber or translator comes to the forefront. So when you see a certain text, where do you assume the pianist to use the pedal? How are you going to write that on the flute and the guitar to reflect that? Because obviously the length of the notes will be changed and the way they are articulated, they change. And I believe that it's really important that our translation reflects that. Again, this is another reason why I think solely copying the score might not reflect so closely the original intentions of the composer. As we were experimenting with different pieces, we discovered that for us, more and more the pieces that actually were experimental composition of the composers worked the best. So where the composers also used techniques that weren't their most usual ways of composing. So I mentioned the Mozart D minor fantasy, which is a very unusual work of Mozart. It's an unfinished work. We still don't quite know what Mozart's intentions were with this piece. The Haydn A major sonata that we transcribed was the only Haydn sonata that Haydn keyboard sonata that he composed in one piece. So so there is no pause between the movements. And it is also the last movement consists of a set of many variations, which were actually also typical for the flute and guitar, so it resonated with the flute and guitar. And Beethoven Les Adieux Sonata is one of the very, very few characteristic sonatas of Beethoven which showcase a story, actually a very emotional and in a way intimate story. So it talks about the farewell and the absence and the return of Archduke Rudolph, who was a great supporter of Beethoven and whom Beethoven really admired and had a very personal relationship with. My last slide here shows the output of the works that we have created. So you can see here the Mozart D minor fantasy. All of the pieces were actually published by Doblinger in Vienna and are possible to order online. So you are able to find them and play them yourselves. This is the Haydn D major sonata, which is almost like a double concerto for the two instruments. This is the sonata in A major that I talked about, which is composed in one as a whole. And here is the most substantial one, the Beethoven sonata. So this is really a substantial and big sonata, and I especially actually enjoy playing this one. I would like to show you a couple of examples now of translations. So let me show you 3 snippets. One of the snippets is from the beginning of the Beethoven sonata. I'm always starting with the original piano version, and then the flute and guitar version. So here, for example, I think you could have heard that we have created a dialogue between the two instruments. You have heard that we transpose this sonata. I will come back to that in a moment, but let me show you another little example from the third movement, and then I'll switch the picture to myself so you can see me as well, and I'll tell you some more about these snippets. Yes. So let me switch back to, I'll stop sharing the screen so you can see me again. And yes, so as you could hear, the Beethoven was transposed. So I haven't talked about that yet so far. This was one of the important questions. We had to see how the different works work the best on the flute and guitar, and of course, because of the different range of the instruments, we had to find the best tonality to use. Very interestingly, when we work with works of Mozart and Haydn, again, here comes the translator's aesthetic judgment. When we were transposing any of those sonatas, it was really interesting. The characters, the whole atmosphere of the works seemed to change so dramatically that we actually dropped those translations. With the Beethoven sonata, interestingly enough, we felt that on the flute and guitar, it brought the sonata closer to the two instruments, because anyway, the flute and the guitar is kind of much more pastoral-like, much more, in a sense, well, it is certainly a softer and kinder and more personal ensemble than when we think of the grand piano, although we can challenge whether that is actually the most authentic way to play these pieces, because the original instruments from the time are also really, really different from the grand piano. So we can also actually regard those performances as translations or transcriptions in themselves. In any case, because the Pastoral Symphony is written in the same key, we felt that actually really resonated with the flute and guitar version. The second example that you heard, you might have remembered that it was a big virtuoso, huge melodic line in the piano, and in some cases like that on the flute and the guitar, we actually build those up in a little bit smaller way, which meant that here and there we removed some of the original bits written by Beethoven, just because we felt that the drive of that musical phrase worked very differently on our instruments. So where Christina said that this sounds all really terrifying at first, and it did sound really terrifying at first to me, and I think the way it becomes less terrifying is that I just basically studied a lot of original pieces of Beethoven, Haydn, and Mozart. I studied how they have used various instruments. I have studied original works on the flute. So I more and more became to understand what the language of our instrument was of the time, and what the language of the composers was, and how those could be merged in these pieces. And also I think I developed a methodology of creating the translations of my and our language of translating. And so it started to be a coherent whole, and I think that's why it needs time, and it takes time to create good translations. It takes a lot of experimentation. It takes a lot of experimentation on stage as well, but nevertheless, I think it is something very important, and it is something that adds a lot to the currently available flute output and repertoire. I can see there are some chat things. Thank you so much for your comments. I also wanted to show you live the scores. So here are the scores. I will. This is the Haydn Sonata in A major. This is the Haydn Sonata in D major that you heard at the beginning, and this is the Beethoven. I can show you a little bit from the score. So that's how it looks like. And as a closing act of the project, we also, or for the time being closing act of the project, we also recorded a CD, which is called Transforming Traditions. And this is showcasing all of the sonatas that we transcribed, translated, and the Giuliani Grand Duo Concerto, just to have one influential piece from the original repertoire, so the listeners can hear what the difference is between the original repertoire and between the translations. I would actually love to hear some of your questions. So I thought to show you a short video. This was taken at the time of recording Transforming Traditions. I also talk a little bit about musical translations on this video. And while you listen, do think of any questions that you would like to ask. And then I can answer them after we have listened together. So once again, I'm going to share the screen to show you this video, and then we can go into the questions. Musical translation is a process where we use the original keyboard scores, and the aim is obviously to find a similar meaning, gesture, musical content on our instruments. Obviously in the process, the music starts to live its own life. It really becomes a duo from a monologue, and it transforms into something completely new, resulting in an absolutely groundbreaking musical experience, something that you normally never experience on the flute and guitar. Katalin Koltai and I have been actually working together for over 16 years already. We have met at the Liszt Academy in Budapest and have been working ever since. From very early on, we were really interested in developing repertoire that's unusual and building up projects that are groundbreaking for the flute and the guitar formation. The sonatas that you hear are sonatas by Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven, solely transcribed by Katalin Koltai and myself. And they are works that have been never transcribed for the flute and guitar duo, so they are absolutely original. Alongside the sonatas by Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven, you will hear Grand Duo Concerto by Giuliani on the disc. This is probably the most substantial original work for the formation from the early 19th century, and it kind of provides a scope to understand how the works created by us fits into the currently available canon for the duo. The music has an extreme drive. It is very, very energetic, yet superbly sensitive. So it will take you onto a journey that should go very far. So buckle up and enjoy. Whether it's possible to transform traditions, I would say yes, absolutely, why not? We are there to create new things and to imagine new things for our instruments and show something that was not known or heard before. I think that is an essence of an artist. So here I am, and I'm going to check yes, question. So I see a question from Sophia here. Have you ever considered making transcriptions with other classical instruments? Other classical instruments, so you mean making transcriptions? Well, of course, I mean, I made many transcriptions for flute and piano before, and I have made, I actually just recently recorded a CD with the Mozart D major quartet and the Mozart C major quartet, which is obviously original, but then I added two Haydn quartets that are originally composed for the string quartet from the Opus 76 series, D major and D minor. And so that was another experiment, although it was in a sense less complex in comparison to the flute and guitar translations that I've been working on, just because here I actually didn't change anything in the cello and the viola part. So I only changed things around between the flute and the violin. Which obviously works very differently. I mean, the violin works very differently with the flute than when we compare it with first violin and second violin setting. So that was something very interesting, and I think definitely what I've learned throughout the years. The knowledge that I have accumulated creating these flute and guitar translations, I would like to use it in the future with different instruments and with different repertoire, and I continue to be very interested in creating repertoire that others, for example, didn't transcribe before or haven't performed before. I hope that answers the question. I can see from Ruby, what would be your main piece of advice to somebody who wants to write their own transcriptions and arrangements? I think my main piece of advice would be, well, I think first of all, my main piece of advice is to listen to lots of music. I think the more repertoire you know, the more understanding you have of music and of instruments in general. And I think, at least to me, it first works this way, that I just really listen to a lot of pieces, and if something captures my attention, and if I just really become to like a piece or a certain composer, and then I start to dig into it, I start to listen to many different performances or many different pieces of that certain composer, and then comes the second step to actually inspect the score in detail to see what the possibilities are for this piece to be transcribed for the flute in combination with any other instrument. So, of course, if you are looking at a violin piece that was originally composed for piano and violin, and you want to play it with piano and flute, that is a very different process than for example, if you decide to transcribe, for example, an orchestra piece for flute and string trio. So these are very different. I think at first it is good to practice on smaller pieces. It is good to practice on easier pieces where you don't transcribe the whole structure of the piece, but you transcribe only solely your instrument, and I think through that process, when you start to do that yourself, you start to realize the resistance of the material. You start to feel what are the points that are difficult to translate or transcribe, what you personally find challenging within that piece. I think it can be also a good exercise to make your own translation of a piece that some others have already translated, just to see what different ideas you are coming up with. And then, of course, when you get into transcribing or translating more complex works, then you have to become a little bit of a composer. So you have to analyze the piece on every level to decide how you are going to recreate that on the medium that you have chosen to use. But I think this is, as I said, to me, this absolutely roots from interpretation on the flute. So it's a very natural process. It feels like it feels like I'm just expanding my interpretation that I would apply anyway, and I in a sense highlight my interpretation, because I highlight it on the different instruments that I would use. So I think in a sense we all have a practice of that within us. It's just in a sense a different technique of uncovering that practice, and like everything else, the more you do it, the better practice you are in it, the more confident you become in it, you accumulate a lot of knowledge, and I think part of the reason why I thought it is great to write a thesis is because this will be accessible for others. So there is also lots of scholarly writing that you can approach and find ideas in them and examples in them. So I think those are very helpful as well. And then, of course, you can consult with other flutists and professionals and composers, for example. So I think it is this process of learning, experimenting, studying, and so on and so forth. Let me see. I see from Hal, at what point in your process does it become apparent that you will need to transpose the piece? It's a very, very interesting question. I think transposition. So original. I think to start out with, I never wanted to start out with transposing the piece. Just because, especially with these composers, I think the specific tonality that they chose for the piece has a very important meaning. I'm sure that many of you know that there are some scholars who really thoroughly believe that the tonality will tell you lots and lots and lots about the characteristics of the piece. And even though I wouldn't say that I agree with all of that on the whole, but I do think that the chosen tonality reflects a lot from the way the piece actually carries itself, the light, how dark it may sound, or how how the colors actually appear. And so I think to start out with, I was extremely careful to think about transposition. However, when there was too much of register changes that I felt would be needed to apply, and I could see that by transposing the piece, that could be much better solved. I think that was the moment where I started to experiment with that. But then again, I think the aim was not to necessarily translate that piece, because when the piece kind of really got distorted in the process, then sometimes I felt that we need to give up, because if we transpose it and we change so much, and the whole character of the piece changes in that process, that is not true to the original intentions anymore. Again, of course, the where you draw your borders within that, it's again your own aesthetic question, which you, in case you write a doctorate, you need to really be able to defend thoroughly in every case. But I think that is how it worked, and I think I always played the piece for a long time in its original tonality, even if I had to change registers, or even if I had to experiment more. And then when I really understood how it feels on the flute, that's when I started to transpose it, and I was looking for similar colors and similar characteristic. And I was trying to see whether that works, that actually works in the other tonality. So I was really careful of that. It may be different with different repertoire. I think if you are addressing the Viennese classical era, this is an especially sensitive issue, and this may not be so sensitive with other composers, but it is definitely something that is a decision that is not taken lightly. I will see if there are any more questions. I don't see any more questions at the moment. Just now that we have concluded, of course, 1 hour is a very limited time. So I think after talking about this in general, the interesting thing can be to actually take smaller examples and show those in detail with various parts of the scores. But the reason why I pointed out that the scores are available is because you can actually use them to study the transcription and the original one, and to see the various ways we have translated this music. And later on, of course, you can read my thesis, and I'm also going to post on my Facebook page once again the album, the link for the album Transforming Traditions, because this you can also listen on Spotify, of course, and also on YouTube. It's better to listen on Spotify because I think the sound quality is even better, but nevertheless you can access it on YouTube as well. So you can also listen to those with the piano scores in your hand. So I think that can be already a really interesting experiment to do, and I really encourage you to delve into this yourselves, because I think, as I already said, everything comes through practice. So I think none of us is born to do everything right at the first instance. But I think when you practice something, then as I said, you really become to understand it, and you will have your own way of working with the scores and the material. I can see two more. All right. Thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoy to be able to share things about my project with you and my experiences, and I hope that it may serve as some inspiration for you. I'm always very interested to hear other flutists' transcriptions, and I think the amount of output that was created in the past years, only if I look at that, was exceptional. And altogether, I think we can make the flute world even more colorful through these translations.
Oh, well, thank you, Noémi, for joining us today and really just sharing these really unique pieces of information and views. I think it is something that isn't addressed or taught nearly as much or spoken about because it is just kind of a scary subject to start. But I hope it helped give people some more inspiration during this time. And I think we all really enjoyed everything that you shared.
Thank
So,
you. Thank you so much.
so